Good morning. Welcome to our Monday Soundbites as we continue to study the scriptures together and to reflect on some of the Bible themes we've left behind the book of Haggai. Today we're starting a new series looking at the book of Ruth in the Old Testament, following the book of Judges. Let me read to you the first 5 verses of the first chapter of the book of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the most neglected teachings in the church is what's called providence. That is the assumption that everything that happens in the world does so under the active control and rule of God. It's by God's providence that the earth continues to orbit the sun. By providence, God's enabled us to be watching this on the video today with no crisis or distraction to prevent us. From the greatest to the least events that happen, the Bible teaches God actively rules in everything. Yet today, people tend to assume that you can only see God actively working in extraordinary events, in signs and wonders or miracles. We're happy to accept God is at work when someone's miraculously healed, but if they suffer and die, we assume, well, God wasn't completely in charge of that one, was he? Yet the Bible consistently teaches that God's providence can be painful, it can be costly, but he is still just as much in charge. In the pressures and hard decisions that face us in life, trusting that providence becomes hard and painful too. And that's the lesson of this book, the book of Ruth. It tells us how God in his providence overruled a tragedy and brought a great good out of a very painful evil. It tells of the faithful covenant love of characters whose clinging to God, whatever the cost, was finally vindicated. It's a story for us going through the testing times that we face. Well, we're told in verse 1, of course, that this story is set in the time of the Judges, a time when those who looked for God to work saw him judging his people for their rebellion against him, by sending a succession of invaders who oppressed the land, and when they cried out to God in repentant faith, he would raise up a judge and supernaturally empower that leader to save the nation, and for a time bring them back to more faithful worship of God. But as time went on, the book of Judges tells us they got worse and worse at that. It was a time when God did extraordinary things, yes, judging and saving with miraculous power, but the big question for normal people is God involved in the down-to-earth day-to-day problems of our lives? And specifically, what is God doing when life goes wrong? And here's the first principle behind providence. Providence is God's way of turning our eyes to him. Are we made to look to him for guidance? So in the book of Ruth, here's the problem. It's the story about the people of God who start in the land of God's promise. Remember the land flowing with milk and honey? Well, the land where God would dwell in their midst. Here's a mismatch right at the beginning in the very first verses of the book. Because instead of flowing with milk and honey, the land is under a famine. Now, there's a clear theological reason from the book of Judges why that is. Before every disaster, in Judges 3, verse 7 and 12, 4, 1, 5, 1, 8, 33, 10, 6, 13, 1, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, it says, and the Lord gave them over to a pressure or persecution. The fuller explanation of what's going on is in Judges 2:18. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies for as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshipping them, and they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. In other words, all the promises of blessing were associated with seeking the presence of God. But he also promised them that if they rejected him, they would reap what they had sown and come under judgment. When the people of God take for granted the presence of God, the providence of God may withhold the blessing of God. That's the theory. Follow it again. When the people take for granted God's presence, his providence may withhold his blessing. The painful providences of our lives are designed to renew our dependence on God, to drive us to our knees so that we begin to realize that it's his grace alone that saves us and blesses us. I'm convinced that one of the things we're facing as a church in our own day, when we're under COVID, when so many of the things we take for granted we're prevented from doing, is exactly that experience. What is the consequence of COVID for the church? Is it driving us back to the Lord? For surely one of the reasons he's allowed it is to strip away all of the other things that we enjoy about church, social things, our praising together, and bring us back to the heart of whether we find him in the midst of it. And like the Israelites in Ruth, it should make us ask, have we been taking the Lord for granted? Are we faithfully serving him? Or are we more in the habit of faith, the habit of church, of seeing friends and doing what we do? God works by his providence to turn our eyes and our hearts back to him. I hope that's what we've been doing as a fellowship. I hope these painful times have made you pray to God. Or have we just been carrying on and hoping for the best? We need a church that will turn back to God and lament the pain and seek again his grace. But that's not the story of this book. It's not the story of a church returning to God like the book of Judges keeps telling. It's much more down to earth. It's about a family, an ordinary family like you and I have, facing testing times in the midst of God's providence that he's allowed on the nation. It's easy for a church leader to say when times are hard, pray more. But I wonder what you'd have done if you were Elimelech. You live in Judah, there's a famine, you've got a wife and 2 children to feed, and ironically you come from Bethlehem, which means the house of bread, and you've got no bread. What do you do? Well, this is a middle class family. They've got enough money to make their own choices, so they decide to move. And ironically, Elimelech, whose name literally means, Eli means God, is Melech, my king, God is my king, decides to leave God's kingdom, the promised land of Israel, and goes to Moab, traditional enemy of Israel, because there's food there. Did he do the right thing? How do you decide? Is that the thing? Do you save your family but go to the wrong place? Both Abraham and Jacob migrated out of Israel when famine came. God led them there. But what came first with Elimelech? Was it faith in the Lord or pragmatism? Well, guess what? We're not told, explicitly at least. Because here's the second principle of providence. Providence is God's way of turning our ears to him, not only our minds. Are we listening to God through our circumstances? If the first principle is to look to God to guide us, this second principle is to listen to God through the circumstances he allows. Now, whatever Elimelech's plans to save his family, they didn't save him. He dies. Verse 3, he wasn't in the place of promise. He was trying to save himself and he failed. Providence means that our choices matter to God and make a difference in our lives. You reap what you sow. That's hard. That's why we're wise to listen to our circumstances, because not every disaster that comes to us means that we've done something wrong, or every pain that we have means that we stray from God's path. But we are supposed to be listening to our life. So, for example, we know this sinful world is not heaven, and one day God will make it again read perfectly. So how does God make us love the stuff he has promised us forever more than the stuff we have in the present? How does he lift our eyes from the stuff that will pass away to the reality that lasts? It's usually providence, the painful providences of life. Every twinge or pain or our aging reminds us that we should value things that are eternal far more. Now, of course, some painful providences are simply the consequences of our wrong choices. You know, if a chain smoker gets lung cancer, it isn't that God hates them more or that he likes some others more than them because they didn't develop the disease. Rather, it's the consequence of pumping those unnatural chemicals into a body God designed not for that. He may allow the consequences of our actions to wake us up to the damage we're doing. Is that Elimelech? We're not told, but you can draw your own conclusion. Elimelech dies out of the land of promise. And Naomi, rather, now is left with the consequences of his decision. The provision for the family fell on her and her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. So now they are responsible to look to God and listen to God's providence, to lead their families in what's right. So what do? Do they go back and look to God and listen to God? Not exactly. Because despite one of the defining laws of the Israelites being, do not intermarry with the people of the land, in verse 4, they both get married to local girls and settle down in Moab for 10 years. Elimelech's original intention in verse 1 was to live for a while, for a short time in Moab. But now it seems they've settled down for good. They've left behind the place of blessing. They don't seem to be members of the people of God anymore. They're not looking to God. They're not listening to God. They're apparently lost to God. And in the midst of that moment, Naomi faces a second tragedy. Verse 5, both her sons die. And now she's lost it all. She was a lone Israelite in exile in a foreign land with nobody to help her in her old age, with the trauma of a triple bereavement and the prospect of a life of hardship and poverty. There was no social security system in her day. Without family, nobody could take care of you if you were sick or old. Widows had no land or rights, and unless they remarried, they'd have no home and security. And Naomi now is past all of that. Have you ever experienced that sort of regret when things haven't worked out as we'd hoped? Have you ever been there? A job move that went wrong, or a marriage that broke up, or children who've rebelled against their parents' faith, not being there when a loved one died? We all cry, where did I go wrong? And soon that follows with, why did God allow that to happen? That's the pain Naomi's feeling here. Deep loss and loneliness in a foreign land, in a land that she wasn't supposed to be in, but they'd made her home. They'd made their bed, and they were lying in it. But, and here's the story of the book, Naomi wasn't paralysed by her pain and grief. She doesn't dwell on the past with regret and ask if only things had been different. Amazingly, she finds in the midst of this pain a real faith. Providence does that work in her heart. She begins to look to God and the promises that he made to his people. She begins to look at her circumstances and the consequences of the wrong choices that she's suffered. They'd been 10 years in Moab, long enough to be part of the community there. Yet through God's providence, Naomi found she still trusted the covenant Lord of Israel and felt that her real home was in the land that God had promised to his people. And so in verse 6, when she hears that the Lord had come to the aid of his people, but by providing food for them, she acts. With no long farewells, having very little to take with her, verse 7, she simply left where she was living and set out for Israel. Not knowing what lay ahead, she still trusted that to be in the Lord's place with the Lord's people was better than being alone in a foreign land. And notice there are no angelic messengers. There's no dream or special word from the Lord, no prophecy. It's simply in the providence of God, that experience that she is told what to do. See, we don't normally get special words or special dreams to move us. In fact, if you do, you need to really watch it, because the clearer the vision, often the more costly the call. But providence is how the gentle truth of God ruling his world breaks in on the lives of people like you and me. It turns our eyes to him because we recognise that we need him. Pain does that. And it turns our ears to him because we start listening to a different story, a different way for our life to be as we look at the world around us. And so we begin Naomi's story. And it is a story for us. The reality of a life of faith is that God may not miraculously intervene to prevent tragedy from touching our lives. Naomi's tragedy became the testing ground of her faith. When all else failed, she held fast to the Lord's sovereign providence, and her eyes were opened to God again, and her ears heard the implications of her situation. It wasn't easy. It felt bitter and painful, like it does to us. We'll all face tragedy, hardship and suffering at some time in life. Because this world is not the world we're made for. This world is still struggling with sin and suffering. But the challenge is, in the midst of the painful providences of life, will it make us open our eyes to God and open our ears once again to his promises and open our lives to experience his presence and blessing? Well, next week we'll see more of how God works and shapes this life through his providence. Before we do, let me just end with a prayer. God our Father, thank you that over the painful circumstances of our lives, you are in charge. Open our eyes that we may see your hand to guide, and open our ears to listen to the lessons of our lives, that we may walk in the path that you have for us, and experiencing the blessings that you have promised. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So more from the wonderful book of Ruth next Monday. See you then.
Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy love. Take my feet and let them